We are back, and we are joined now by Neil J. Young, writer and author of Coming Out Republican, A History of the Gay Right. Neil, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, the gay Republican. when, how do you start your history of the gay Republican? Where is the first kind of marker that you'd like to throw down in terms of the conservative movement and gay people or LGBTQ plus people within that movement?
Yeah, I mean, when I set out to write the book, I thought that it would start in the late 1970s because that's when the first gay Republican organizations were formed. But as I dug into the research, I realized I actually wanted to begin in the 1950s, in the era of the Cold War, and this period that was known as the Lavender Scare, where the federal government was, repressing homosexuals all over the country, was criminalizing their behavior, arresting them. But I realized there was a lot of prominent, very closeted, but important gay Republican activists, both in Washington, D.C., who were, fundamental to the rise of modern conservatism, and also folks who were out in California, where a lot of my book is set, who were starting to be politically active, but were doing so, again, as closeted or semi-closeted gay Republicans.
The Lavender Scare, can you expand on that? And what were the origins of that moral panic, basically?
Yeah. So in the 1950s, at the height of the Cold War, there were, huge fears that the country was under communist threat and that subversives within the nation would betray the country to the communists. And so there was, the Red Scare, which was about rooting out communists from the U.S. and especially in the federal government, this idea that they were in the State Department, that they were turning over state secrets to the communists, to the Soviet Union. But there was also this idea that homosexuals were a subversive threat to the nation, because the idea was that homosexuals were very likely to be turned. This notion was that they were sexual deviants, and so they could also become political deviants. They would be easily turned into communists, and that they would serve as spies within the federal government, especially the State Department. And so both political parties were very committed to rooting out homosexuals from any service in the federal government. But that spirit and even that sort of political effort bled out to all over the country. So local law enforcement in every city was, interested in finding homosexuals, arresting them, criminalizing them, and really ruining their lives. And this was a horrific and really invasive work on the part of the government to criminalize and ruin homosexuals' lives in the mid 20th century.
How were laws deployed in that way? I mean, were there a lot, we see in the context particularly of abortion right now, like the reuse, the re-upping of anti, of pro-censorship or laws that are supposed to regulate basically people from being deviant in any way. What were some of those tactics that law enforcement used?
Yeah, so this started at, at the top. President Eisenhower issued an executive order in 1950 that, that oversaw the government's work in rooting out homosexuals from government employment. But, at the state and local level, there are all sorts of vice laws that had to do with things like gross indecency or public indecency. And these gave law enforcement and police huge leeway to arrest people that they suspected of being homosexual. I mean, they didn't even have to necessarily catch someone in the act, but often they saw, groups of men walking down the street, or if you were sitting in a park, you could be arrested on charges of gross indecency. And so those are just sort of some examples, but I also think it's really important to know that every department, every agency of the government was really devoted to this. This included the U.S. Post Office. The Post Office was in coordination with the FBI, was surveilling people that they suspected of being homosexual, watching their mail, tracing it. If you subscribe to a physique magazine, or if they noticed that you were writing a lot, if you were a single man and you were writing a lot of letters to other single men, they would put trackers on those other men's mail. And so, and if they suspected of being homosexual from the mail they were writing or the mail they were receiving, they would turn their names over to law enforcement and have them arrested. And so I think people don't appreciate or really know this history of how extensive law enforcement and the federal government network was in finding homosexuals and arresting them, criminalizing them, and again, ruining their lives.
And I have so many questions. One is, I noticed the focus on men, right?
Yes.
This moral panic being fairly directed towards homosexual men, but also when you mention the FBI and its role in having the post office track individuals in this manner. I mean, J. Edgar Hoover, if you could just talk about him and his sexuality and how that played into his obsessiveness on topics of this matter.
Yeah, I mean, so he's very important here. Obviously directing a lot of this work, and historians have weighed in, including Beverly Gage's recent biography of him, that says that he very likely was involved in a long-term relationship with a male that was very close to him and that worked with him. And I think that there's a lot of sort of figures in this period who we view, I think rightly so, as hypocrites because of the way in which they were living their lives one way, but directing the government to repress homosexuals' lives. And so I think that just sort of speaks to the nature of the fear that was at work in this period and how overwhelming the sort of spirit of the Lavender Scare was. But it is important to know that and to recognize that there were homosexual men who facilitated that Lavender Scare. And I think a lot of them, such as Hoover, did so to direct attention away from them.
Right. And the focus on men, I think about often, like, we're in the midst of an anti-trans moral panic, and so much of it is about trans women, right? The idea that somebody who was born with male genitalia is actually a woman is so threatening to this cultural conception of masculinity. Yeah. And I think that pairs nicely, I mean, not nicely, but in the way that the moral panic or the Lavender Scare and the crackdown that resulted is focused on men and homosexual behavior there as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really smart connection. And I would say that, in a patriarchal society, which the US is, and particularly so in the mid-20th century, fears about manhood and masculinity really shape a lot of governmental action. And I think also just like cultural responses to changing gender expressions and changing sexual norms. And so, lesbians certainly had difficult experiences during the Lavender Scare, and they were also targeted as well, but not at all to the extent that gay men were. And part of that was that gay men tended to have a lot more public lives. Like, they tended to be a lot more sort of out in the open to the extent that closeted persons were at all. And so that's part of it. But I think at the deeper level, it is this sort of panic around manhood and masculinity. And again, what that meant in the Cold War context, right? We're in this arms race with another nation. We're worried about the future of our society and our nation and our strength at home, because that sort of registers on the world stage. And I think that's how these things sort of got tied together.
I mean, it occurs to me, and I want to move past the 1950s in a second, but that this is really, honestly, the birth of the modern conservative movement that we see to this day, of the linking of anti-communism, which ends up being free market fundamentalism for them, with a social conservatism that was about cracking down on gay people, on lifestyles that they deem outside of the mainstream, or and also, of course, married with their anti-civil rights agenda. I mean, you can see that is the Republican Party really to this day.
Absolutely. And I think you're absolutely right here to point to this moment in which those different components of the right, which aren't necessarily affiliated with the Republican Party in the 1950s, are starting to get stitched together into what we would call the new right in the 1970s, which is this broad coalition of different sorts of conservatives who are linked together in a national movement. A lot of this work is happening at the grassroots level, right? Connecting cultural conservatives to anti-communists to free market radicals, and stitching it together into what we really recognize as a coordinated Republican Party, especially around like the 1980 election and the rise of Ronald Reagan. But absolutely, it's getting forged in the 1950s in the height of the Cold War. It's sort of amping up through the 1960s and the cultural transformations of that era, and really, I think, coalescing in a 1970s movement of grassroots conservatives that has like a religious right that's ascendant.
Yes, and so let's go to the 1970s, right, where the backlash against the revolutions, the civil rights advancements of the 1960s, as well as massive cultural changes of with feminism and progress in those areas. You see the 1970s as an era of backlash, right, and the expansion really of the government's role in basically like being tough on crime, the federal government's role, whether it be the origins of the drug war as a way to have that backlash formalized against often black and brown people in this country, but as well as it relates to gay people and using the federal government to crack down on gay folks. What was the role of the gay Republican during that era?
Yeah, because this is a period in which part of what's happening is the development of an I was going to say anti-LGBTQ, but at the time it would have been known as an anti-gay politics that's taking shape in the mid-1970s. You think about 1969 Stonewall. Is this turning point in gay history where so many people start coming out of the closet. And also in the early 1970s, a lot of cities and local municipalities start passing these non-discrimination laws that are tied to homosexuality, towards gay identity. And so that's sort of happening in the early 70s. In the mid-1970s, you have this religious right movement that's just starting to form. They're starting to get united around an anti-abortion cause, but they're also recognizing that sort of gay rights are moving forward. And so there's this backlash effort of anti-LGBTQ stuff that's happening in the late 1970s. This is the moment in which gay Republicans really come out of the closet and start organizing. And there's a particular reason they do so, which is here in California, where I live. In 1977, there's a state ballot initiative that's put forward by a very conservative state legislator from Orange County named John Briggs. And it was Proposition 6, or as it was commonly known, the Briggs Initiative, which was on the 1978 California state ballot. And had it passed, it would have made it illegal for any gay or lesbian person to work in the state's public school system. And so this is the moment in which gay Republicans recognize they have to come out of the closet. They have to start organizing as gay Republicans to defeat this ballot initiative, but also to show the Republican Party, especially in the state of California, hey, we belong to your party. We're Republicans. We believe in, the Republican Party's traditional message of freedom, opportunity, and equality. And we're not only going to defeat this ballot initiative, we're going to push out who are these Bible beaters that are trying to come into our party? Who is this religious right that thinks that they're Republicans? We're going to push them out of the party and make sure they never get a foothold. And so that's the moment in which this is happening really in California, but they are developing a movement that ultimately spreads across the nation. As these gay Republicans say, we belong to this party, we're not going to see it change in the direction that it seems to be going.
They were not successful.
They were not.
It's almost as if that you can't make progress in that regard in this party that targets marginalized people broadly. But it's fascinating that the California element to me.
Yeah.
Harvey Milk, of course, in the 1970s becomes the first openly gay elected official in the country and is assassinated. talk about the role of the San Francisco politics of that time period as well in fostering that backlash within California Republicans.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked about Harvey Milk because one of the most surprising and just wonderful things I discovered as I was in the archives, actually in San Francisco, looking at the papers of the first gay Republican club that was started, which at the time was called Concerned Republicans for Individual Rights. It's now known as Log Cabin Republicans of San Francisco. It's been around since 1977. Harvey Milk was involved with the founding of this organization. He was at the first meeting of this organization because Harvey Milk, although he was a Democrat, he believed that gay people had to, first of all, come out of the closet, and they had to show both political parties that they belonged to them. This idea was none of us are being well represented. And honestly, the Democratic Party wasn't all that much better on gay rights or accepting gay members in the 1970s than the Republicans were. And so there was this notion that this sort of bipartisan organizational effort needed to happen. We'll belong to both. We already belong to both parties, right? We will show ourselves to be visible within both parties. And through that, we will make gay rights, we'll progress gay rights, and we'll show that gay rights are a bipartisan issue or ideally nonpartisan issue. In San Francisco, it was also really interesting to discover that the local leadership of the Republican Party was incredibly supportive of the formation of these gay Republican clubs because Republicans were basically so underrepresented in the city. Not many people in San Francisco were registered as Republicans. Republicans didn't have any political offices. And so the Republican leadership there thought, well, maybe the path forward is us tapping into this very large population of homosexuals who live in this city, getting them to register with the Republican Party and hopefully electing local officials. And so San Francisco is this sort of unique spot in California in many ways, but particularly in the ways that it actually is the birthplace of gay republicanism, which I think most people wouldn't think of. The Republican Party at the state level in California, and certainly in Southern California, that was much more conservative, was not nearly as welcoming or as encouraging as of this development of gay Republicans. But San Francisco, because of the nature of its politics, and because of the fact that Republicans were so underrepresented, it really became, for many years, the sort of central, the nexus of gay republicanism, and certainly formed the sort of foundation upon which the larger movement was built.
And you could probably put a pin there and say this is the original infrastructure for passing Proposition 8. I mean, right? In 2008, was that when Prop 8 passed? I know we're skipping ahead.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, is that a fair assessment?
Well, I think that yes, and I also think the important thing to point to is California again. Like, California is this place of progress and also this place where we see conservative backlash happening again and again around LGBTQ issues. And there's this old saying that's used a lot in American politics, which is, as California goes, so goes the nation. This idea that this state, the largest state in the country, is sort of leading indicator of what's going to happen in the country politically. And I think that's right. But I also think that this sort of narrative of progress and backlash that you see over and over again in California is represents the sort of larger development within the country of progress and backlash when it comes to LGBTQ rights. So California, is one of those leading states when it comes to the passage of same-sex marriage. And also it's a place that sort of immediately generates an enormous backlash that becomes a really defining one for the country as, Prop 8 is passed and this huge progressive measure is overturned. And that's seen as like decimating to the development of same-sex marriage rights for the entire country, as it is for a short period of time.
And who's governor of California during this time period? One Ronald Reagan. I guess that we could talk about Reaganism, how that relates to gay Republicans and gay rights in this period. And also, I guess if you could expand a little bit more on who the log cabin Republicans were as they become a faction within the GOP.
Yeah, so in the late 1970s, the folks who are forming these gay Republican clubs, which are, most of them have sort of log cabin in their name. And of course, that's a reference to Abraham Lincoln, who they believe they are in the sort of true tradition of. They tend to be, I mean, it's like 99% of these clubs are white gay men. They're almost all entrepreneurs or small business owners or professional types, lawyers, businessmen. In a lot of ways, they look like the average Republican man, other than their sexual identity. But they tend to have a very sort of conservative fiscal policy, even as they want the government, or excuse me, the Republican Party and the government to change around sort of issues of gay rights. But they really argue that they're libertarians, right? And they have this idea of like the government should stay out of my bedroom and out of my wallet. And that a smaller government, a restrained government that has less power, is the pathway to freedom. So that's the message that they're developing in the late 1970s. And certainly that's what they believe the Republican Party stands for. But as you note, I mean, this guy, Ronald Reagan, who had sort of governed as one way as California governor, he's going to be very different once he becomes president of the US in the 1980s, particularly because why does he win his election? In large part because social conservatives, the religious right, bands behind him and makes him president. And so he acts very differently in the 1980s. And also we have the rise of HIV/AIDS happening. So that's changing all the politics here. And in a lot of ways, I think it's catching these gay Republicans by surprise and turning their party into something that, they certainly don't stand for and they really don't recognize.
There's so much here. I mean, there's the identity of gay Republicans in the sense that, like, does white man come first?
Right.
Right. And then, of course, there's the Reaganism element and the reactionary backlash and to HIV/AIDS and his essentially allowance of HIV/AIDS to spread because basically it's God's will telling gay people that you're wrong, and so it's a pandemic for gay people to punish them, I guess. I mean, like that was basically the way that Reagan approached it. And then also, I mean, you have Ed Koch in New York City too, right? Who was a gay man himself.
Right.
And how he bought into this as well. I mean, I'm this is barely a question, but if you could just talk about that period.
Well, it's an incredibly important era of American history, and particularly of the modern GOP, because, and there's folks like Gary Bauer and Pat Buchanan who are high-ranking Reagan White House officials who are like hardline conservatives, and they are really pushing the sort of ugly anti-gay politics that we see emerging, particularly in the late 1980s around HIV/AIDS. And one of the things that I found really fascinating was if you look at public's polling around homosexuality in the early 80s, it's a lot higher in terms of levels of acceptance than I think we would have imagined for that period. But what happens is the HIV/AIDS crisis becomes sort of so overwhelming, and social conservatives really use it to ramp up a new wave of homophobia within the Republican Party, but across the nation more broadly. And those public attitudes about homosexuality, they plummet in the second half of the 1980s. And I think importantly for the sort of trajectory of the Republican Party, you see the reemergence and the reinvigoration of social conservatism in the late 1980s, early 1990s that becomes really ugly, becomes really anti-gay and really vicious. And of course, that affects the anti-abortion efforts and all sorts of other hardline social conservatism that's happening in the late 1980s that really leads to sort of the ugliness of the 1990s. And I think actually puts the Republican Party in the trajectory that we see today with the anti-trans stuff.
You also mentioned in talking about California, the origination of gay people being threats to children in schools, like I guess being formalized within Republican circles. You can see that obviously today with the DeSantis politics.
Right, exactly. This groomer discourse. So that
Yeah.
was very much part of the, Proposition 6, the Briggs Initiative. It was also coming out of Florida with Anita Bryant and her work in Miami-Dade County to overturn a gay rights ordinance there. This idea that, and Anita Bryant said this, and this became sort of the talking point of the nation, or the talking point of the right, was that homosexuals couldn't reproduce, so they had to recruit. And who better to do that than public school teachers who spend all day with your son and your daughter? And so I think all listeners can hear the resonance and the relevance of that old discourse to what's happening right now, and the panics around schools and classrooms and elementary education, and all the ways in which DeSantis, I think, tapped into and revived those notions of a groomer panic. And now, of course, it's like, in some ways, it's like detached from homosexuality itself, but like, I think that is obviously the origin of it, and remains sort of like, I think, the central nerve of that panic is this idea that particularly homosexual men and women are a threat, and they're predators, right, to your children. And so, this stuff doesn't go away. It just sort of gets refreshed and remade for new moments.
And I guess this is around the time too where gay people really begin organizing for their rights, as of course they would, given the just absolute trauma of the HIV/AIDS
Right.
pandemic and the lack of political will to help gay people as a protected group, or LGBTQ plus people. And how did that begin to happen? Because like even in the 90s, Bill Clinton signing Don't Ask, Don't Tell into law,
Yes.
Biden, our current president, supportive of
Yep.
that as well. Like this is as you say, Democrats were not good on this. Like how did the organizing begin?
Not at all. And, even like Sam Nunn, who's, the ranking Democratic leader on the Senate, the military committee, puts forward Don't Ask, Don't Tell. So Democrats are not doing well on this at all. And I think that, again, the panic over HIV/AIDS as this public health threat shaped so much politics, and it was shaping politics both among Republicans and Democrats. But gay people were organizing nevertheless. And I think because of all this, because of the oppression and because of the real bigotry of this era, a lot of that organization is happening on the left. It's happening through gay democratic organizations. It's also happening through these sort of mainstream gay organizations like the Human Rights Campaign and other organizations like that. But I think that you see a real recognition from gay people in this period of how bad they've got it, and also of how high the stakes are, particularly around a public health crisis. And also, they don't want to go back to where things were just a couple of decades ago. And it really seems like that's a possibility, right? We're not that far away from people living their lives completely in the closet. And I think in the 1990s, people really woke up and recognized. And so you have the March on Washington in 1993, where 1 million LGBTQ people come out. That is an incredibly significant moment, and of showing, visibility, of showing presence, of showing how large a population this is. And so for all the backlash, all the repression, and all the hate that's developing in this decade, I also think you see a huge commitment from LGBTQ people to not be silenced and to not be brought backwards.
And we are in another moment of reaction. So I guess we'll just take it to the present day as we wrap up here, Neil. The anti-trans backlash, the anti-groomer backlash from Republicans. I mean, some of these figures, like we had an IM write in saying, Laib Habibi says, Roy Cohn was a mentor to Trump at the center of of North, the Red and Lavender Scares, and a homosexual himself. He's dead now, but this is not far in the past. And you mentioned Caitlyn Jenner, right, as a figure, almost as like a log cabin and trans person, right? And we have guys like, I mean, who knows? We don't know for sure, but Lindsey Graham and other Republicans and other people who play this role to this day. So to bring it to the present, here, Neil. What is your view of this moment of reactionary sentiment?
Well, I think for, all the progress that has been made, and it has been significant. I mean, and also in a short period of time, it's also, as you say, important for us to remember that that progress has not been around for very long. And so the potential for backlash and really regression here is enormous. And I think we see that in the current efforts around the anti-trans stuff. Gay Republicans argue, because they've supported a lot of the stuff of stuff Ron DeSantis has done and others have done, that Trump has done, that is, anti-trans efforts. They've said, well, these are sort of limited, narrow pieces of legislation that are, that make sense for the particular thing they're targeting. And the thing that I asked over and over again of the contemporary gay Republicans I interviewed was, are you not worried of where this is headed? And none of them are. And I think that that is very naive of them, because if anything, history shows us that these things are not disconnected, they're actually deeply woven together. And that the anti-LGBTQ movement has always been very coordinated. And it wasn't interested in just sort of, nitpicking an issue or two here or there and reforming it, but actually of pushing history backwards. And so I think that that's the thing we all have to be mindful of and aware of where this is potentially headed.
Neil J. Young, the book is called Coming Out, A History of the Gay Right, Coming Out Republican, A History of the Gay Right. Thank you so much for coming on today. We will put a link to your book in the description wherever people are listening to or watching this. Appreciate your time today.
Thanks for having me. It was a great conversation.
Agreed.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.